Thanks very much, Anthea, for a lovely welcome, and to the Linen Hall Library as well, which I did spend quite a bit of time in various collections and so on. So it's a very joyful place to be, very calming place to be, which is always, I think, a good thing when you need to seek some solace from contemporary life. So I'm really delighted to be here to share my research, and I am going to keep myself on time so that because I know it's a lunchtime talk, and I could go on and on, but I'm not going to. So this is quite an edited, I suppose, overview of really, the role and status of design within one company. A little bit of background about myself. I'm a design historian. People sort of go, what is that? It's a historian who really just focuses on design. So it's kind of pretty straightforward. And I've always been really interested in little histories and hidden histories and secret histories, and that's opposed to big history. Those kind of big cataclysmic and seismic histories. So I've always loved looking at the overlooked and small things and individual objects or individual that actually can tell really quite complex stories about who we are and how we operate and so on. So it's kind of mixture of maybe cultural studies, anthropology, why we like things so much and why we're attracted to them. And I suppose gravitate towards textiles because we have a very intimate and immediate relationship with them. We wear them every day. We use them every day. We sit on things that are upholstered. We draw curtains. We wear clothes, and so on and so forth. So that intimate relationship with us, as in terms of humankind, is, I think, really quite important and very often marginalised and maligned. So for me, as a historian, it's my job to kind of bring those stories to the fore. So I suppose that's the kind of remit. I also have a particular penchant for company histories. So when I was an undergrad, I used to kind of, again, gravitate to these particular companies that usually I admired, their particular design ethos or their outputs or so on and so forth. Again, they tended to be designed for mass production. So I've never been particularly interested in very elite design that only the few can, afford. So I know that some scholars are very interested in, maybe designs for royalty and particular elite cultures and so on. But I quite like just everyday objects, that we all can kind of access and use and so on. So that's a little bit about me, so which I hope kind of helps explain why I came to the Old Bleach. When I was, I think, an undergrad or a postgrad, I can't remember, but I read lots of stuff by other design historians who mentioned the Old Bleach, but they didn't seem to know very much about the company. And they were always mentioned in the company of other very, very well-known textile companies. So I always thought there's something there that they are known, but they're kind of unknown as well. They don't really know very much about them. And I mean, we're talking about really quite significant design historians like Leslie Jackson, for example, and Christine Boydell, and so on, and Mary Shozer as well. And they all seem to know very little. And even Valerie Mendez, who worked in the V&A, had mentioned them, but again didn't know very much about them either. So I thought, yeah, there's something here that they're mentioned but not really known too much about. And I did wonder, is that something to do with the fact that they're Northern Ireland and that you have to be in Northern Ireland to research those kinds of companies? It's a bit of both, I guess. I don't know whether in Northern Ireland we have a particular tenacity in researching things that, and you can get in and get to know people in a way that maybe if you're an outsider that you can't get. I'm not really sure. But I have to say, so I'm not from Randalstown. I have no connection to the company in that respect. And I came to the company via other design historians' research, but I knew that they were a really interesting company, and the more research I've undertaken, I realised they are a fascinating company. And I think even through a PhD, which ultimately became around 150,000 words, actually I was scratching the surface. There was really, and actually my PhD is only the interwar period, so I don't even do the kind of beforehand and what they were up to afterwards. They're interesting for a number of reasons. They had their fingers in lots of different pies. Lots of textiles pies, lots of promotional pies, advertising, marketing, industry, roles, and so on and so forth. So even for a design historian, very interesting, but for economics or social historians or business historians, all there's something for everyone. So I'm kind of starting off with a very text-heavy slide, and I apologise for that, but I think it's kind of quite interesting to start with when anyone's doing research in Northern Ireland, and I know that some of you here have undertaken research locally. I found it really challenging to do research in Northern Ireland in a way that I did not find challenging when I was researching the Old Bleach in England. Archives, and in Scotland as well, archives and institutions, like museums and libraries, university libraries, were so welcoming and supportive and kind of couldn't do enough for you. Here, it was slightly different. There was a kind of slightly weird protection thing going on about, the arms around it's very strange. So I think if anyone is doing research into anything in Northern Ireland, I salute you. I think you've obstacles in your place which you have to try and remove before you can start. So that sounds like sort of a real big caveat, but and I've just kind of taken this from a report from chartered accountants, which is quite fancy name, I can't really remember. But even the accountants mentioned this in a report to say apparently it has been the practice of the company, and this is Old Bleach, for some time to destroy records shortly after they have served their immediate usefulness. We are of the opinion that this practice is imprudent and is unusual in the case of a company such as yours. So, in other words, that was a kind of very standard kind of practice, which was really, I think, thankfully frowned upon and advised against. But in my case, the records for the Old Bleach are incredibly fractured and scattered to the kind of four winds, I guess. I was very, very lucky to meet one of the last production managers of the factory before they finally closed the doors in 2000. And he had been there for about 40 years. He had been tasked with destroying a huge amount of records, and he was thankfully so upset by this. And and he wasn't just bewildered; he was raging. I mean, he was really cross about this. And he knew the value of it, so he actually filled his car with as much as he could. And I've been forever grateful that he didn't drive a Mini. He drove a big estate car, and he was able to load it up and get as much as he could. So that was good. But it also is slightly reflective of, I suppose, his bias, which was production and kind of, that sort of, so a lot of business records and production records were kept, less so of the kind of design and creativity. And actually, I suppose that's what I'm particularly interested in. And hopefully, I'm going to show you a sort of an overview of the kind of stuff they were doing in terms of design across much of the 20th century. So So yeah, so I was able to access that collection, that kind of archive, which is held privately in Randalstown, and I'll probably keep working on them to see whether they will maybe eventually, donate it maybe to the public records. The problem is that, and I really understand this, is that because I have my own little collection of Old Bleach artifacts and grey literature and stuff, so much so that my family have called my little study the Old Bleach Museum, and I go off to it every so often to do my research and reading. But and I would love to donate it, obviously, as a collection, in the knowledge that it will help other researchers in the future. But where does it go? Does it go to somewhere that will basically put it in a room and it'll stay there for 30 or 40 years and never get accessioned and actually available? Because just simply the resources aren't possible, so it's very difficult, and I think there's something about, and I think what's so great about the Linen Biennale is that it really is this kind of like red flag about our heritage and about the role and status of linen, and what we were able to produce here, and it actually does have a future. So it won't be the same as the past, but it still has a future. So that sense of keeping it in the forefront of our own minds, I think, is really to be applauded. So right, some nice pictures now. We'll move on to the visuals. So the Old Bleach, I don't know if I know there's some of you here from Randalstown today, which is really lovely. And I kind of hope to show you some things that maybe you weren't aware of or haven't seen before. As well. So this is obviously an aerial view of the factory and mill. We've got the village on the left, and then the River Main. Obviously, water supply is essential to any linen production or textile production, and then we have a mixture of weaving sheds and so on and so forth. Up at the back we have number 3. We have the what was the carpet factory, which was built in the post-war period when the company were diversifying further, and so you can see it's kind of quite a big concern. At their peak in probably the interwar period, they were employing around 1,300 people, and I think had around just over 1,000 looms. So they were a kind of big going concern, big global company exporting right across the world. And when you think about 1,300 in terms of an employer, about that's a village plus outlying districts and so on. They also opened, I think it was a stitching facility in Kilrea, in County Derry, London Derry. I end up in the National Archives in Kew, and one of the reasons why I end up there is because in this small archive in Randalstown, there was some pieces of fabric with design registration numbers on them. Now I knew what they were immediately, and actually this was very common practice. It wasn't unique at all, but it was a way in which companies could protect their designs from copyright. I don't really know whether they did or not, to be honest, because I don't think anybody really went after them. And actually, if you look across, companies that were designing around that period, they all seem to be designing quite similar stuff. So there were kind of variations on themes. So I'm not really sure what the purpose of that was. But for a researcher, these records are absolutely critical, especially when you're dealing with records that you haven't got a nice intact complete archive, that you need to go elsewhere and you need to go to the four winds to find information and so on. So actually I ended up spending quite a lot of time in the National Archives in Kew, and they have been really useful. So and that was largely down to the company registering their designs. And what's really interesting about when you register a design, you actually think it is good enough. It has a quality, it has a sense of this is worth protecting. So there's a kind of an ambition there and a confidence with the company. So before I kind of talk a little bit more about that, I'll just sort of backtrack basic contextual information about the company. They're established in 1864 by Charles James Webb and his brother Richard Thomas. They are they kind of restore an idle cotton mill in Randalstown, which had been really, I think, lying idle for something like 14 years, something like that. And it had been a cotton mill which really suffered because of the American Civil War and the lack of supply of raw material of cotton because of the American Civil War. So it lies idle for about 14 years, and then Charles James and his brother Richard Thomas take on the mill. What's interesting about seeing these registrations is that in the registers on the left, which are really just kind of paper records of, and very basic record, very basic description. And then on the right is the book of representations, which is a you have to straighten your back and bend your knees to get these out. They can be very heavy. You get terribly excited about opening these because you kind of know of the untold riches and treasures held within, but also disappointments as well. So I get to that in a minute. But you know that you're actually going to see evidence of design work from the company in this instance. So there is something tremendously exciting. Oh, this is how I get my kicks, right? So for me, this is exciting. So the company from 1875 are, once the Trademark Act has been passed, they start registering with the Board of Trade, these design registries. And these can be items which are inventions. They can be, all manner of things, from ornamental pieces, ceramics, you name it, anything that is designed, which is pretty much everything that's human made, can be copyrighted and protected. And then there's obviously specific disciplines for textiles. And then within that, there are subcategories depending. They can be damask, they can be cotton, they can be different kinds of materials, etc., etc. However, they're not distinguished in the registers, so you have to go through, and it's tedious, but you have to go through these registers and just find the name. But then you train. It's a bit like training your algorithm. You train your eye, and suddenly, Old Bleach pops out very, very quickly. I'm only there for a few days at a time, and quite frankly, their opening hours are shocking. If you've just flown in from somewhere and you have to be out, you're kicked out the door at 4 o'clock. So you don't have time to write any of this down. But thankfully, the National Archives, you can photograph, so you can just photograph the record and then kind of get on. So you can work quite quickly, but you don't, when you go to the National Archives, you don't have lunch, you don't have break, you don't hydrate, because then you'll have to stop and go to the bathroom and all that. There's no time for any luxury, so you just have to keep at it. So it's, you can eat and do all those other things later on after 4 o'clock. So these are the first designs that were registered by Charles James Webb, and they're unbleached linen weaves. There's just 3 of them. The date is August 16, 1875. So he wastes no time in registering his work. So I think that ambition and that confidence is really quite astounding, and that does not waver throughout pretty much the 20th century. And the company finally closed their doors in 2000, but by that stage they're I think just a hemming facility, so they were not manufacturing really anything past, I think it was either the very late 80s or the early 90s, something like that. So and by 2000 they're a hemming facility. So that's the first three there. And then this middle one is second design, and it's registered by Webb Brothers. So the name slightly changes from Charles James to Webb Brothers, and then in the 1880s it becomes the Old Bleach Linen Company that we know today. So initially it wasn't called the Old Bleach, that came a little bit later. a lot of people are a little bit vexed as to why it's called the Old Bleach, and they go, why would you call it Old Bleach? It's a weird name. But it was just a very traditional method of bleaching linen on the greens. And actually I took out those slides about the bleaching on the greens because I thought, we'd be here all day. And so that's what the name refers to, and they couldn't really call it the traditional bleaching company. It was just, they went with the Old Bleach, and that was where it came from. And so these are some unbleached and bleached huckleback towels with coloured thread embellishment in 1879. So we actually see quite a nice, through the National Archives, through those design registrations, we see design evolution. And even though it might be modest because it becomes a little bit more decorative, I mean, I'm not a weaver and I'm not technical, but huckleback towels are known for their absorbency because of the weave is a little bit rough. It's a kind of like a honeycomb structure, like a honeycomb pattern, and it's like a slight kind of slightly pebbly kind of surface, so it has a lower weft count and a higher warp, which means that its absorbency is good. And I can't remember whether it's the weft or the warp, which is slightly twisted or softly spun, so you have the absorbency there. They're also quite compact as well, so they're not bulky, like towel loops that we kind of all seem to favour today. So they look like little slivers, little flat slivers, but actually under microscope they're really very, very interesting structures. So you see these kind of coloured embellishments. Unbleached is when well, they're not left out for quite as long or at all, and they tend to be stronger apparently, but I'm not entirely sure about the science behind that, so I'm not going to dispute that one. So we see some more red thread embellishment appears in Webb Brothers, and then it becomes Old Bleach from 77 to 82. So we also see longevity of designs from 77 to 82, which is kind of 5-year period, to be kind of producing very similar designs and so on. And these were obviously very fashionable as well. The Old Bleach were definitely aiming to probably a higher end of the market. I mean, their products were probably quite expensive. They had a variety of royal warrants and patronage and so on. The Queen Mother ordered some stuff for Clarence House, and this is all kind of documented, probably in their own promotional materials as well. For me, I was seeking to find how active they were in design engagement. This is from 1901, is an Old Bleach sponsored open design competition. Competitions kind of served a number of purposes. They were both promotional about the company, but also they were very useful source of creative ideas. So it meant that you could harvest good design at a relatively kind of low cost. Okay, so these are a few pieces of hand-rendered artwork for promotional material. Thankfully, the minute book survived in the hall from the company archives, and they're really indispensable, because minute books for any company are the company director sitting down and discussing, what needs to be done, and so and they're quite pragmatic. They're not emotional records. They're really straight up records of what the company's doing, and to a certain point how well it's doing, etc., etc. It also looks at things in the pipeline. It records those sort of things as well. The Old Bleach spent a lot of money on promotional material, and they employed one of the top London agencies, W.S. Crawford, to do their design work for them, and they always felt that sense of promoting oneself, keeping oneself right under people's noses was really instrumental, so that you became a very well known kind of aspirational household brand, if that's not a paradox. So these are all hand rendered, as would have been the case at the time. So using the technologies of the period. The one on the right is for John Wanamaker's department store in Philadelphia, and so these were designs that were very specific for specific markets, so they didn't just produce generic things. They were very much for different, both for the Commonwealth and, right across the globe, but for the American market, which, even up to the mid-30s was still, still their biggest market, even though by then it was much diminished. So this one on the left, advertisement, they would take out, full page advertisements, and this one from Country Life in 1910, lots and lots of text, very typical of the period. We then begin to see with publishing and printing technologies, more visual material coming through and less textual treatments as well. An old bleach tablecloth is a thing of beauty and well nigh a joy forever, which, yeah, we now know is slightly over-promising, but yes, and actually, if you look at what survives now, there, much of it has survived in very, very good condition if it's kept in proper conditions. Always, a bit like I don't know, certain food products in the dark, dry space, and it's, but it normally yellows, or if it's too warm, or over dry. Customers were encouraged to look for the maker's mark in the cloth's corner, and in this case it was an OB within a little sun motif. In my experience, that doesn't feature in everything. It usually features just in the damask. So so not the kind of necessarily the everyday kind of objects. The 1920s and the 1920s and 30s was a period of huge upheaval. I suppose that when I think of my focus, I always think of being very focused on the interwar period. There is so much going on, kind of a recovery from one world war, the Jazz Age, these stylistic sort of distinctions. This idea that certainly within America that modernism and modernity was entirely possible through the means of capitalism, but from Europe you're getting this kind of modernity which was very artistic and very design conscious and so on. So we're kind of in the middle, and someone like Old Bleach was kind of taking it from both sides and so on. On the left, you probably can't see the text here. I'll just read it out. It says, housewarming by modernist couple who went one better. And then up here, which is, we have the modernist kind of square, prismatic and cubed house. We have, well, anyway, the people who have taken it seem to be the usual shape. So, so there was, and what's really quite, Punch famously lampooned newfangled ideas as being sort of slightly ridiculous and so on and so forth, because they were either continental or so a wee bit of kind of xenophobia kind of embedded within that as well. But there was a sense of being fashionable and new, and modernity was really trying to celebrate the what's called the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, and the technologies at the time, and so on and so forth. And companies like the Old Bleach were looking at this and thinking, this is our future, in an industry that is contracting, and contracting really quite kind of dramatically. By 1924 in Northern Ireland, there was approximately 67,000 employed in the textile industry here. By 1934, so 10 years later, there's about I think 20,000 less, or sorry, 87,000, and then by 1934, 35, there's 67,000. So suddenly we've in a 10-year period a contraction of employment. So you can look at it in a number of ways about an industry kind of changing and so on. And it is one of spectacular fluctuation, which is kind of not unusual. And there was lots of kind of external reasons for that. But certainly the Old Bleach were thinking, right, in terms of being fashionable and so on, how do we kind of make ourselves really quite competitive? One of the ways they did that was by pioneering and perfecting vast fat dyes, and that was in the early 1920s. Previously considered impossible, as the natural gum in the flax fibre was resistant to dyes. They spent 3 years of really quite arduous trials before the company launched quite a small collection of around 14 shades in 1924. And I just included this because it actually was much punchier on my screen, but it's a really delightful peach coloured napkin celebrating, with machine embroidery, celebrating Queen Elizabeth II's coronation in 1953. I mean, I think within about 10 years they had developed like 39 fast fat dyes. So that kind of race within linen dyeing was really kind of down to Old Bleach's own research and development laboratory, which was quite pioneering at the time. But that was in conjunction with LARA, which was the Lambeg Research Association. So we probably all know a little bit about the hand painting. So that's the kind of much fabled and I think romanticised hand painted cloth. I mean, I look at this and think quite pragmatically about how really laborious that was. About, I mean, physically leaning over these, they can't raise the table. You know, there's no health and safety in those days, you know, and it was executed only by women. And what's really interesting, I think, Cheryl Buckley, a design historian, has made this point about women potters in the pottery trade in Stoke-on-Trent. And she was kind of talking about Clarence Cliff and Susie Cooper and so on. And she talked about in that period, there was a sort of what bordered on a biological essentialism around women's ability to only work kind of within the domain of the decorative, the light kind of, easy work, and that it was men that got to do the sort of heavy lifting with 3D design and so on. And that was very much the case, I think, for the linen industry as well. That, by the way, is another lecture. So, but happy to do that next year when the year after. But what's really interesting about Old Bleach, they were much copied in their hand painting, but it's very intricate, precise work. Now, the design would have been ideated by the designer and then woven, obviously by the weaver and so on. So really, we're talking about a very intricate colouring in process that went through 4 stages about colouring in. Mistakes made were then taken out in a kind of post. I think the 3rd stage, and women only coloured one colour at a time. So you can see that's why up on the left here you've got coloured cloth, and then it would come to purple, and then some would have their little pot, I think, and then they would do the purple, and so move on. So it was a kind of Fordist production line. So these are from a surviving, now thankfully the design studio's design library was rescued, which is very compact. It's only about 60 odd books, but they are gems. They are really some absolutely amazing gems. These sort of design books and folios are very standard apparatus in any design studio. They're used for inspiration, they're used for what's called appropriation copying, which is fine because you can't think of everything on your own. And these are just a couple of pages. The one on the left is deliberately for design studios to inspire and use as templates. And the one on the right is quite interesting because it is Old Bleach's own, like a kind of scrapbook that they've put together themselves about museum plates and photographs, and then there's little captions in each one with detail, much of which comes from the BIENNALE in London, which is quite interesting because I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute as well, because they end up in the BIENNALE themselves. We also have an example of Sonia Delaunay's Composition Couleur et D from 1930. It's a spectacular folio of about 40 pochoirs. Pochoirs are just little stencils, fancy French name for stencils, and they're exquisite. I mean, they just are exquisite. I mean, she was kind of at the vanguard of abstract design in the 1930s. She had the misfortune to be maybe married to a man who got slightly more attention. But that's not the lecture. But here we can see some pencil marks and so on. The folio, I don't think is complete. I think there's some missing. That wouldn't have been unusual. You know, some would have just got accidentally, you know, binned and not realizing how special these are. I think, you know, they sell through Christie's auction house and places like that for maybe £3,000 or £4,000 now. You know, so. There's a copy up in Randalstown. So I haven't told them how much that's worth, just in case they do so. These are a few more plates, and again, apologies that you can't see these, but you see these pencil, these gridded. The grid method is a very standard design method of kind of copying, you know. Copying, I think, has a really bad name. You know, it's a very standard practice in design, and what happens is that, you know, you can copy, but then you can you know, scale it up or scale it down, but you can also recolor it and so on and so forth. So the act of copying isn't really as kind of bad as it sounds. You can even turn things upside down and just change the entire, you know, thing of it. So that's a couple of pochoirs. What's interesting about these is that these are dated in the studio, 15th of August 1961. So it's very likely at that time they would have been maybe used for tea towels or for tray cloths, or, you know, kind of some smaller pieces of linen. Well, by 1960s, we're probably talking about linen blends, you know, linen unions, so cotton and rayon and so on. Even though rayon was being used in blends in the 1930s as well. Design sources from porcelain books in the OP design studio. So they did a whole series of you know, English porcelain series, French porcelain series, continental porcelain series, and really that was you know, at a sense when formal dining was still really very popular and very fashionable. On the left, we've got some tablecloth designs, and these were considered to be really quite modern and fashionable for the period. Estoril on the left and Lido on the right. And these are two photographs from the National Archives. So one of the things when you register design is that you have a choice of sending either a sample, you know, a fabric sample, or a maquette or a small version of whatever it is, or you can send a photograph, or you can send an illustration. So when I got to the National Archives, obviously I was hoping for fabric samples, and there were very few. They were nearly all photographs, you know. You know, textiles, you need to feel textiles. You need to, you know, you have to get a real sense of even the slubbiness of linen, or, you know, the wefts you can do, you know, weft and work counts and so on. You get a kind of real richness of detail in them that you do not get when you look at a photograph, because you're only looking at a representation of something, you know. So that's always very, very disappointing. I was also disappointed that when you had designs like this, which are called imbricate designs, so like overlapping, you know, that you kind of want to see how they do that, but photographs very, very difficult to ascertain. And obviously, when you see it like this as a flat thing, and we know that textiles aren't flat, or rarely flat, so we kind of want to see them how they're actually meant to be in situ. And here we have them as in a little kind of sales booklet, that really the salesmen would have shown department stores, so that this wouldn't have been for, you know, the public. This would have been for retail stores, you know, department stores and so on, to actually select what patterns they were going to choose for the next, you know, the next season. And then these are the versions of how the clothes would sit on the tables. 1935, much of the company promotional materials were designed by Crawford's. The main designer on that was Ashley Havenden, who really probably was one of the most famous graphic designers at the time. In the 1930s, designs started to be authored. So, whereas kind of prior to that, we had obviously William Morris and so on, but by and large, design was a kind of an anonymous trade, and certainly big kind of industrial companies would tend not to kind of give authorship to specific designers. It would be by, the Old Bleach studio or by, whatever the company was. So Ashley Havenden was designing for, as under the auspices of Crawford's agency, but for the Old Bleach, and this is one of their pieces. This shows Portia from 1929, and within the text it says, "Colour damask was the industry's response," sorry, they're my words, "to annoying little mats that slip all over the place." And that was a kind of a response to the challenge of the trend for mats, placemats, which kind of came from America and the continent as well, because in Northern Europe, in Scandinavia, they were using mats, and in America they were using mats as well. So this was a kind of an industry. There's lots of industry responses to those kind of challenges. Coloured cloth was also became very popular once vat dyes were perfected. So I'm now going to kind of move on to the furnishing fabrics, which is really how I kind of came to know the Old Bleach. So it wasn't through the kind of domestic linen, the tablecloths, damask, and so on, but actually the furnishing fabrics. I'm slightly anxious that I've only 5 minutes left, so I'm just going to race through this lot. But hopefully this is very visual, and I won't need to explain too much. So these two are the first two pieces that the V&A buy from Old Bleach, and in doing so, you have the nation's premier Museum of Decorative and Applied Arts have purchased two of these pieces, and they remain in the collection. I don't know if they've ever been on show, but they are within the Archive of Art and Design, and that they are there. Anybody can book in to see them. It's not that easy; it's a slightly complicated process, but worth it. And what's really interesting about these is that they're both black and white, so they're not kind of colourful and so on, and they're very much kind of off their time. They kind of show this slightly quite dynamic movement and shape-shifting sense that really abstract art and futurism and modernity was kind of capturing at that time. The one on the left is called Rhythm, and on the right is called Sperm. They're both designed by Norman Fitzroy Webb, who was one of the family members and had trained at the Royal College of Art, was one of the first pieces when they launched the furnishing fabrics in the 1930s. So we have this one, which is reversible, many of which were reversible, which I think reversible anything is genius. So I think in a sustainable age that we should be thinking about reversible clothes, reversible everything, you get double the wear, etc., etc. So Dundrum, and you have this sort of dynamic chevron, very, very popular pattern from the stage. At no point do I say that Old Bleach are doing anything different from their contemporaries like Edinburgh Weavers or Old Glamis, which were Donald Brothers, and I think they are part of a stable of pioneering, progressive manufacturers. So I don't make that claim that they are really unique and they're doing very different stuff to everyone else. But they're doing some really quite lovely stuff as well. And I think the confidence kind of grows throughout the period in terms of design, and they really produce some very bold stuff indeed. One of their weapons was it was J.P. Gatto, who was one of the company directors, who was married to one of the Webb's sisters. It's all a bit incestuous. But his son, Felix, had gone to the Slade School of Art in London, and he was a painter. I mean, the Slade's really for painting, but he ended up doing a 4-year apprenticeship with the Old Bleach. I think he was a genius designer. I got very, very lucky in that I tracked down his daughter, who lives in Suffolk, and went to see her. And she had talked him into writing a memoir, and I was really hoping there'd be tons and tons and tons of detail on the Old Bleach. Actually, it's very little. It was kind of a very small part of his life. He didn't really, I don't think he really loved designing. And he does reflect at one point and say, you know, I wonder if I had had more kind of oomph about the designing, could I have really made something? And I think undoubtedly he could have. I think he had the kind of design chops to do so. So these are two of his pieces, a printed, screen printed linen and rayon, and a woven piece. One's in the Whitworth Gallery in Manchester, and the other is in the Victoria and Albert's archive. You know, so these are, I think, by dint of them being in those collections, are really important pieces of design. And I think that's really important. That, you know, the story about the Old Bleach and their design chops are you know, are so good. This I call paperclip. And only I have never been able to identify it, and which has been, gosh, 20 seconds left. Anthea circling. But I will. I'm gonna, you know, I'm ever persistent. And counterchange patterns were also very popular in the period. These are also designed by Felix, and they're quite lovely, and they're quite kind of whimsical and so on, which is very typical of the period as well. Right, okay, I'm going to keep going. These are probably the two of the best known ones. So Penguin on the left is a screen printed rayon on linen, and on the right is Mandalay by Felix Scotto. This one on the left is by Jean McGregor, who was working in the Old Bleach factory as well. The V&A regularly use these as Christmas cards and you know, gift wrap and things like that. And one can see why. They are just beautiful pieces of design. One's obviously kind of playful penguin. What's really delightful about something like this is that you've got this little, you know, threesome here, a duo here, a single one, and they kind of appear to have this sort of slightly kinetic, you know, movement, but they're not, they're static, you know. But that's really good design, is when something appears to be not quite what you think it is, you know. And it's just visually very arresting and very kind of, I just think very warm and lovely, you know, and so, and she also designed some stuff for with Winnie the Pooh on it. So the company had also got copyright from A.A. Milne. In the archive, there is a contract with A.A. Milne's signature on it, and then a reversible piece by Gatto. This is again obviously Penguin, and that's Winnie the Pooh. And this is from Heal's Guard books, which is held in the Archive of Art and Design. And what's really useful about these is that these are records of how well it sold and how long they stocked it for. So those kind of records really enrich, you know, our knowledge and information. One of the best known designers from the period, from the 1930s, was an American designer called Marion Dorn. And this is called Aircraft on the right and Zodiac, on the left, and Zodiac on the right. And again, both many of these screen printed patterns are on the same ground, what was called quarry cloth, and so that kind of hasn't really changed. But it was a great canvas, you know, really good, and it tended to be this sort of slight buff colour, which meant that it softened any harsh designs. The left is very large interlocking scrolls, and then possibly my favourite, because I think it's just a bit odd, there's these kind of coral pattern, and again screen printed, called Symphony by a Russian designer and artist called Paul Mansurov, who tended to design for theatre. And obviously when you have these very, very big patterns, very big kind of, scale and repeat, but they tended to be for very large spaces. So they weren't for domestic use at all. They were for, cinemas and theatres and so on. Samoa on the left, and then Persian Rose by Ed Crofts on the right. And this is Jacquard Weave at Manchester, and then on the right is another screen printed. So really quite large scale, quite bold as well. Another piece by Marion Dorn, and probably maybe her best known piece by Coral, and then another piece by Clonmel on the upholstery there. And you can even see from this styling here, what we call, styling, that about how the kind of aspiration of the company, we had very, very tall Georgian mansion type country houses, for the, so I mean, this is kind of who they're pitching at. They're selling through heels, amongst others, so these are these higher end department stores. It's really funny, when I spoke to anybody from Northern Ireland about the furnishing fabrics, most people have no knowledge at all of the furnishing fabrics, which is such a shame, because it was such a big part of their production, and they were obviously made and printed because Old Bleach was quite vertically integrated. They were doing an awful lot of the processes. They weren't doing just kind of one or two, and they were doing their own in-house printing as well. So some more Granard and foils on the right, an advertisement with a few more examples. Some of these I've never been able to identify. They're either not in the National Archives for some reason. Sometimes you would get a bunch of registrations and one would be missing, and it would say registration missing. So, and you can do nothing with that. I mean, that's just a gap in knowledge. But these are contemporary, usually architecture review type, lots of design journals, and so they were also aiming at architects to use the work as contract work as well. So they're not just necessarily aiming towards the public on those ones. And this is from price list, which again would be a trade price list, showing the kind of patterns involved, and things like this. You could see how stripes, kind of variety in stripes were used. Paperclip, well, it's not called paperclip, I call it paperclip, and a few more of these kind of wavy geometric ones, but bold. I mean, really quite bold in their patterning. Some intricate designs, these overlapping movement, and so on. It turned out that Felix Scotto was a huge love of sailing, and so actually a lot of his designs have these motifs, but very fashionable motifs at the time. Python, quite animalistic patterns as well. Cobra, this one up to the right that we see here over in the left as well. Guidor and Waterford, Ober and Gola. A lot of the fabrics are named after areas and districts and so on right across Ireland. If I have time, no I don't, to talk about the slides, these slides, but I'll maybe quickly return. These are both from Sonia Delaunay's pochoir, and then this middle one, to print on a black ground is really very technically difficult, but it became kind of fashionable in the 1930s, and Old Bleach weren't shy about trying to attempt that as well. So what's important here is the black ground more than anything else. To get that kind of saturation of black is very, very difficult, but not to Old Bleach. Popular interwar design motifs are things like tassels as well. So we've got movement, we've got tassels, we've got optical kind of illusion as well. On the left is a slightly more informal version, but then with a slightly more Regency style tassel version as well. I quite like this. This says, here's a lovely medieval design. It is a lovely weight of upholstery cloth. Just the thing for those who want to get away from excessive modernity. So modern life is too much. You can just go back into a bit of period design. And they were brilliant at that. They tended to make quite faithful copies. But what's lovely about the price list is that they actually say, this is a faithful copy of blah, blah, blah. So there's something very honest about them as well, you know. So out of that price list, there is 65 designs, 32 are modern, 11 are period, 8 are decorative, and 14 are plain or figured, which I think is quite an interesting kind of, you know, just sort of content analysis there to go, right, 65, 32 are modern. And you could see that's what's selling through at the period. The two slides that I referred to earlier are from this collection here, and this was really the idea of design reform in the 1930s was huge. The move towards pushing for good design or good industrial art to be competitive. So this wasn't whimsical and silly about, oh, let's just make the design better. This was about, you know, GDP competition, really making the product that, you know, the UK were producing was actually, you know, on a kind of global equal. And these were slides, the glass lantern slides of what was called good design. Now, who decides what good design or not is, I think, is a little bit, you know, is a bit shaky, really. But they're kind of principles of good design, I suppose. And the fact that the Old Bleach were members of the Design Industries Association, and their work featured in there, I suppose, is another sort of rubber stamp of the quality of the design they're producing. This is a trade show that they're showing at, and you can see some of, you know, Python and, you know, Glengarry and a few others. These were essential to, you know, just, I mean, any trade show whereby you get in and you sell to department stores and so on and so forth. Okay, so I'm kind of heading towards the finish here. They were also, because they were so good at promotion, they collaborated with a thread company called James Purcell. They produced a magazine called The Embroideress, and it was mainly to promote their products, you know, their linen and their thread, but it also gave readers a very full education on the kind of practice and history of decorative needlework. And they, if you ever come across them, they are absolutely fascinating to read. So just some Old Bleach machine embroidery on linen rayon. Floral bouquet design was, and florals were probably the mainstay of the company, you know, within the tableware and so on and so forth. And again, you know, they just remain timeless. You know, and they're still hugely popular today. You know, you go onto eBay and you go onto Etsy and so on, and you know, some of these things sell for slightly silly prices. But yeah, so florals have that lovely timeless quality. Spiral spun linen was a new twisted kind of linen, twisted in opposite direction, to give it a sort of an elasticity, which then purported to be increase resisting, but not creaseless. And you know, I think there was always that slight, I wouldn't say hindrance, but that slight sort of resistance that some customers had with, you know, with linen creasing, whereas actually it's one of its very lovely attributes. And then William H. Webb managed to persuade Edith Lady Londonderry to host a fashion show, what we call a fashion show, or a dress exhibition of their new spiral spun fabrics in her London Park Lane home. They managed to get 24 Parisian couturiers to produce models, as they call them, and then 15 London fashion houses participated to also. Belfast Telegraph reported linen too long neglected as unsuitable has ceased to be the Cinderella of dress fabrics. So there's lovely records in Prony here of letters between Edith and William H. Webb and a few others gathering, you know, the organisation of that dress exhibition. There's a lovely letter from her to, I think it's Lady Colville, who was, you know, one of the Queen's lady in waiting, persuading the Queen to come to the exhibition. She said, I don't know if you want to make it, and you know, I'm busy. I'm the Queen, you know. So yeah, but these lovely correspondences. So just to finish off, so that was the kind of post-war period, or the interwar period. They continued to be very design-driven, very design-conscious, and they acquired a number of William Morris designs in the 1960s, and they screen printed these onto cotton with psychedelic colours, which I thought was kind of genius as well. That you bring William Morris patterns, which really had fallen very much out of favour, into again the spirit of the age, psychedelia. Unless the designers were on drugs, of course. But and then just kind of finally. That in the 1960s they were still producing furnishing fabrics up until 1969. This are some kind of geometric pattern which came in 4 colourways. I know there's only 3 there, but likely to be a linen union by this stage as well, because they're not really producing anything in pure linen by that stage. I think it was 1962, they won a medal at the California State Fair for one particular pattern, so still being lauded and so on. So that sort of design trajectory has kind of really pierced through all of their production, and I suppose that's why I don't think my work is ever done. So thanks a million for coming along today and supporting the Biennale. It's wonderful. If you've any information on the Old Bleach, I would love to hear from you, and my details are here. Thank you.
The designs. I think there's probably time for 1 or 2 questions actually. So I'm having problems with my mic, so you might have to use your extra loud voice if you want to ask a question. Anybody any comments or questions about the campaign?
Well, thank you very much. Were these designers in-house, or did they ask people outside who took the different lines to do these wonderful designs? Were they local, or were they?
Yeah, so they probably had about 4 or 5 designers in house, and
4 or 5.
Yeah, oh yeah. So Norman Fitzroy Webb, who did the 2 at the start that the V&A had bought, he obviously had gone to the Royal College of Art in London, and he also appeared on a committee for industrial art in 1932 here. So there was a standing there around. What's really curious about that report and the witness testimony and the evidence given and so on was that he never really talks about his role as a designer. He's kind of quite quiet about that, which is interesting. But yes, he was the head of design, and then obviously Felix Scotto was a family member within and did, I think it was about a 4-year apprenticeship. I think he was quite keen to leave in the end. I think for him it was all a bit kind of too much. They would have had also apprentice designers who would have done the kind of the real grunt work, the sort of heavy lifting, but they would have bought in. So Marion Dorn, who I mentioned, they were big kind of starry names in that sort of design firmament at that time. So they would have bought those designs in. So it's kind of a mixture of things. And certainly, actually, I've just been in touch with somebody who was designing in, I think it was, had just been hired in the late 1960s. And she's now living in Scotland, so I've just been in touch with her. So it was a real mixture, but definitely a design studio with around 4 or 5 people working full-time
In Randalstown?
In Randalstown, in the design studio, and it would have been near the office block, so it wouldn't have been in, with the real dusty, So what's really interesting is that they weren't necessarily very well paid, but they were better paid than some. But in terms of industry standards, it would have been quite similar. So not particularly. So it didn't. I think designing at that time in a linen company in Northern Ireland wasn't high status. It was better than shop floor kind of stuff, but it still wasn't. Whereas I think today we kind of have a much better understanding of good design actually can produce bestsellers, and really before I think it's woven or what any cloth is made, design is one of those processes that's very, very early, but kind of really gets overlooked in some respects. Yeah. So, but very difficult to find out, who all, who all lived there. Sorry, worked there. They probably lived there. In fact, I know one of them lived in a caravan in the backyard. So yeah, for a time, yeah. Thank you.
And we've maybe got time for one more. If anyone has one more question.
Oh, two. Oh,
Well,
how
we'll
to
see.
choose.
We'll see. We'll take that one first.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk.
Oh, thank you.
Catherine. I saw the Old Bleach Linen Company as it is today. I was visiting a friend of Randalstown recently.
Yeah.
And it's derelict, but are there any plans for it? It would be a wonderful site for a museum or
Yeah.
some kind of visitor centre.
Absolutely. And actually, I agree. I think it's, I'm pretty sure it's privately owned now by developers. And they have built on part of the site, which, there is something, I kind of alluded to this earlier about, I think we have a really quite, and Sebastian mentioned this last week in his talk about, our relationship with our heritage, with our built-on heritage, our industrial heritage, and so on. I think in some respects it's been overshadowed by the Troubles and has kind of informed, that. And Mossy Mill is a really good example whereby they have managed to kind of restore it. But what's really interesting is they have no archive of their own. So everything that you see displayed there is borrowed. So they don't have their own archive of artifacts and so on, which is such a shame. Again, scattered to the four winds, But I certainly think the Troubles have played a part in how we've ended up where we are with, not having really good archives and good, the libraries like Crowley and so on, they've got bits and pieces. They're all. But I thought it was really interesting that I had to go to the V&A and I had to go to the National Archives at Kew and I had to go to Whitworth to find what I found that just don't exist here. So actually, they have somewhat nearly better collections than we have. But I think that would be certainly for the people of Randalstown, that would be their wish. But the money, the resources, the cost of all that, And were you able to come to Sebastian's talk last week?
No.
Yeah, it was really, really interesting, and that issue of cost that really is, I suppose, the greatest difficulty.
I really believe that there are little pots of money if you dig.
Yes, I love that idea.
Give us the map for those. I just say that one last
Yeah.
actually my question.
Oh. Yeah. I think, yeah, it's in a very, very poor condition now. But the chimney's still there, and there are still some of the the remaining buildings. Last week I was thinking about, Sebastian's talking about, in England, how they've managed to do it. And there's a really brilliant example in Yorkshire called Saltaire, which is Sir Titus Salt's, one of his mills. And they've restored it to this. It's, it's a gallery. There's a variety of eateries, shops, but tasteful shops. It's not, it's not all home bargains, though I love home bargains. But you know what I mean. It's really, really well done. It's brilliantly done. So I think, yeah, if the will is there, I think it would be wonderful. Randalstown's like 26 miles up the motorway, so it's location-wise, it's incredible. So it's such a fantastic village and such an interesting history. So yeah, it could be destination. Yeah.
I'm going to have to wind down.
Yeah, I know, sorry.
There could be more conversation here, but just want to thank Catherine for a fantastic talk and such a brilliant case study and so exciting and great to see the visuals there of the design. Yes, to say there's 2 more talks as part of the Biennale in here in the Linen Hall in September. And we have our own Linen Office tour running on Thursdays from 2 to 3:30 for the next 2 Saturdays, 2 Thursdays in August. Big thank you to the Biennale and to all of you for coming along today. Thank you very much. And I'm going to have a wee feedback form for you at the end, so if you could fill that in, I would appreciate it. All right, thank you very much.